Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about heroes once again. And whether I mention it or not, every one of my videos is centered around the concept of hero. And today I want to talk about why I think, in part, there's going to be a resurgence of the traditional hero, especially the traditional masculine hero. Not that women can't be heroes. A traditional hero for the last 3,000 years in Western civilization is a paragon of virtue, those virtues being prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, in that exact order. And yes, women and men can both access those virtues, but I would say they access them in different ways. And I want to concentrate on the manly connection to those virtues and how it's been dislodged over the last 50, 60 years, and why we should get back to it, and why this leads into, again, as I said, a resurgence of this idea of a traditional hero in the near future. But before we get there, I just want to let everyone know there are 3 links in the description, and hopefully in the pinned comment, if I remember. They are for my 3 graphic novels. Number 1, Thomas Valiant, has a second chance campaign up right now. That is my completed graphic novel, which you can order. Number 2, The Valiant Heroes, which we're working on right now and is almost complete. It is going to be shipping the end of summer, early fall. You can also order that right now. And the 3rd, which is my upcoming graphic novel, CROM the Destroyer. The first 2 graphic novels were superhero graphic novels, but CROM the Destroyer is a return to form for low fantasy. And if you want to talk about manly qualities, that's what I'm going to give you within CROM the Destroyer. The link is there for the early bird sign up page, which if you sign up early, you get a reminder email when the project goes live on the 4th of July, because who knows what you're doing on the 4th of July. Maybe you might need that reminder. Plus, you will get a free exclusive pinup poster when you order if you sign up early. Oh, because we're launching the campaign on the 4th of July. And by the way, yes, I am going to put Thomas Valiant up on Kickstarter as well, just to see if I can draw in some people from there. And as long as I make at least $500, that's fine. I just want to draw in a couple of more people at the very least. Because for me, every last backer counts. That's how much I appreciate you if you order any of my books. These books are an attempt to give you, the reader, exactly what you want. And you're looking at some of the beautiful art in the background, so if any of that sounds appealing to you at all, click on those links in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novels are for you. Okay, so with this video, I'm going to try to back off the philosophical, really, for a little bit, and talk in a much more casual way about my topic. Let's hope it doesn't turn into a rant. And I'll start exactly there with a conversation which you would probably hear within your comic shop, very much so. Have you ever wondered why they took Optimus Prime from the Transformers and made him a transfer truck, or a big rig, or whatever you want to call it? With all the things that they could have made him, why would they make him a transfer truck? I mean, from the very beginning, you have Megatron, he's a gun. You have Starscream and all the rest, they're jet planes. You have these massive other kinds of machines. Why would they make him a 18-wheeler? Why? Now, I suppose the answer has something to do with the fact that he would probably be the biggest seller, being the leader of the heroes. Therefore, they wanted to make the toy, which it was all about selling the toys, bigger, so they made it into a transfer truck so you could have this secondary compartment, all this kind of thing. But again, the point being is that, yeah, they did that, and at some point someone said, well, let's make him a transfer truck. And they all went, yeah, that works. And if you look back at the 70s and 80s, you'll see this kind of thing happening over and over again. It's not that common, but it's not uncommon. You had movies like Smokey and the Bandit, again, about a big rig. You had television shows like, I think, BJ and the Bear, centered around that as well. If you go back to comics, you had comics from Marvel like US1. And when I was growing up, Green Lantern, who is one of the major heroes for the DC Universe, he wasn't a jet pilot. What was he? He was a long-haul trucker. And of course, my own personal favorite is Jack Burton and the Pork Chop Express. So what's my point? Well, my point is the fact that at some point, each of the people making these products said, yeah, this fits in well with the story, let's make him a trucker, or let's do a story about a trucker, or something of the kind. And nobody really second-guessed that. They just went, yeah, sure, let's do that. But I really don't think you're going to get anything like that today. Sure, you got shows like Ice Truckers or things like that, which I see commercials for every once in a while, but I don't think they're going to make it any kind of a focus within a story that you're going to get in mainstream entertainment. Why? Because being a trucker is predominantly male, and it's a masculine territory, and with all the talk of toxic masculinity and all that kinds of thing, no, they're never going to give you a story like that if they can help it. Whereas traditional roles for men and women within that time period, even the 70s and the 80s, was still well defined enough where they went, yeah, he's a guy, it's a guy thing, they do this. Let's use that. We have no problem with this. So I want to go into two different directions from there with what I've just said. You see, I'm a person who grew up with a lot of old media in my life, watching old movies and old television shows. You just did it when you were a kid back then because having new things all the time was not the norm. No, you got it every once in a while, and you went back and put your time into old things that had been made, especially when you started to get things like satellite dishes or all that kinds of things. So you would see old television, old movies, so I was brought up on old movies, old television. And within the 30s, 40s, 50s, you had men and women, and men were real men and women were real women, and small blue furry creatures from Alpha Centauri were small blue furry creatures from Alpha Centauri. But you start to get into the 60s and especially the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and you start to see a confusion of the roles for men and women. This is why I would say the whole action hero genre came about, really. It was because men were really grasping with what men were, and they wanted to hold on to that masculine, and that was their attempt to do so. And in comics, really, it was a throwback kind of medium at that time, especially in the 70s and the 80s, and you had older ideas of these superheroes. But within the 2000s and 2010s and now into the 2020s, you get the creeping idea of toxic masculinity and the breakdown of barriers wherein you can't have men doing men's things and women doing women's things. You just can't have that anymore. Now, where did this whole thing come from? Well, again, as a kid, I didn't have computers when we started going to school. We had a library, and most of those books in the library were pretty old. And I liked ancient history, and I read these old texts of ancient history. Within those old, actually, scholarship books, what did they say was the downfall of the Roman Empire? And trust me, I'm going somewhere with this. Well, they would say that, and it was readily accepted, that the reason, really, for the fall of the Roman Empire was a lack of masculinity in a certain way. It was because you had men being licentious, which led into a destruction of the most important unit within the Roman Empire, which was the Roman family. This destruction of the Roman family, again, led into more demasculinization, if that's even a word. That led to a severe drop in actual Romans making up the Roman legions, and so they had to take in mercenaries from outside their borders and hordes of soldiers from outside their borders to make up their armies, which then led to a porous border where you had these barbarian hordes coming back and forth over the borders willy-nilly, which led to things like the sack of Rome in 410 AD. But again, they usually trace it back to the destruction of the Roman family brought about by men not being masculine enough anymore. And the thing is that these quote-unquote progressive people with a socialist, communist kind of mindset, they are fairly smart in one way. They do look at history and then they condemn it, but at the same time they use it. And I would say over the last 60 years or more, what you see is that exact same thing that destroyed the Roman Empire, except within the last 60 years here, it's not been something that has naturally occurred. It's something that has been implanted into our society in order to bring about this very specific end of the empire, or the ideas that build up Western civilization. Now, for some people that may sound absurd on the face of it, but again, this is what I cover on my channel, and I want to go over, just very briefly, one of the interviews with Kelly Sue DeConnick, the person who basically created the Captain Marvel character that you see in the comics and on the movie screen right now, an interview with her that I covered talking about this entire thing. First off, she admits quite openly that the Captain Marvel that she created, and again, that you see today, is simply Carl Yeager stuffed in a woman's suit. So again, mixing of the masculine and the feminine. She's a declared intersectional feminist and talks about things like using comic books, as the CIA did, in order to prompt the everyday people into a soft revolution in order for them to invade eventually. And within the interview that I'm talking about right now, which I'll try and put a link in the description for that old video of mine, she talks specifically about advancing the ideology of progressivism through the breaking down of the barriers between men and women. Progressivism, of course, progressing towards, at its heart, a socialist and, in the end, communist mindset. But she said a couple of things which are very interesting within that interview she did with ESPN talking about Captain Marvel. Don't even question it, it was a thing. Number one, she and other women like her, intersectional feminists, always bring up the fact that, well, within the 30s and 40s and 50s, you had women reading as much comics as men, so we should bring it back to that. Or they always pull out, well, look at Japan. Look at manga. It sells even better to women than to men. So no, comics aren't a masculine medium in any way. But they fail to realize that when talking about men and women and these two things, which is modern Japan and the 40s and 50s within comic book sales, that within both of those there is a common thread. And what's that common thread? Well, it's the common thread of men are men and women are women in those times and places. And therefore, you're able to play off the fact that men are men and women are women, and everybody understands this divide and this change, and you can sell to them better. They actually never admit that, and quite the opposite, go in the exact other direction with their argument. And that's what Kelly Sue DeConnick did. She said, I don't see things with women's eyes. And I always have to credit her for actually saying that and opening my eyes to the fact that, well, if she's kicking against that so mockingly, there must be some truth to it. So I went and looked up the science and, hey, guess what? Men's eyes are actually different than women's eyes. Again, she was mocking it, trying to break down the divide between men and women. Why? Because it's true. Because at a biological, even cellular level, it is true. Men see things with men's eyes and women see things with women's eyes. It just happens that way because there is two kinds of cells within eyes. There are M cells and P cells. Guys have more of one and women have more of the other, which means that guys can see color, but usually just primary colors or just off of primary colors. And this is for a very specific reason, because it filters out excess color so they can concentrate on shapes and movement. And women can see more colors than guys can, and as such, they can't see shapes and movement as well. And the scientific basis for this is usually that guys are the hunters, therefore you need to see shapes and movement really well in order to hunt well and in order not to be hunted, whereas women are the gatherers and the keeper of the children, and you need to see whether or not a plant is this shade or that shade in order to tell whether it's poisonous, and you need to look at your child's skin tone and say, hey, wait a minute, that's off just slightly, something's wrong here, so it's an early detection system. But here's the thing. You can see very readily from this why comics are traditionally a masculine medium. Why? Because its shapes on a page, usually, again, when I was growing up and when comics were big, it was just primary colors. So shapes on a page with primary colors in a sequential order in order to mimic movement. So again, primary colors, shapes, and movement. That says guy. And that's not to say that women can't enjoy comics or any other medium, but that is to say that A, if you left everybody to their own devices, it would be much more a masculine medium, and B, if you want to actually sell comics to women, you got to recognize these limitations and these differences and actually play off of them. Again, which is what they did in the 40s and the 50s and what they do within manga. But here's where I want to go with this entire thing and why it connects to the idea of hero. Again, if you go back to the traditional idea of hero, it's based upon logic and reason. It's based upon these 4 virtues. And if you look at that, these things are very compartmentalized, each one of them. The 4 virtues and how they interplay with each other, reason, logic, all of these things are very, very compartmentalized. And this leads right back to what I've been talking about with the difference in the eye structure of men and women. They've done studies on little babies when they could first see something more than just a blob of color, and they put pictures in front of their faces, and they found out that boys were attracted to mechanical things and girls were attracted to human faces. Your quote-unquote progressive people try to make this out as being something which is only taught to boys and girls through societal forces, which they would call negative, but it isn't. Even though there is that extra layer of being taught in this way, it's something biological. And so, from the very first moment when you can actually make out shapes and things like that, yes, boys are thinking in a more mechanical way, and girls are acting in a more personal interaction way, which usually translates into feelings. And let's go back to Optimus Prime for just 1 second. Why do you think that those Transformer toys sold so well, especially to boys? Why? Because it engaged the inner gearhead of every little boy. Why? Because we all have an inner gearhead as boys, because we think about things in a mechanical way and have so for all of our lives. So not only do you get a toy, but it's also a robot, and it's also a car, and it's also a puzzle where you get to figure out mechanically how this thing fits together and is both at the same time. That is gearhead heaven for any little boy. But again, what's my point and where am I going with this? Well, the thing is that it's the compartmentalization. Thinking about things in a more mechanical way allows men to compartmentalize things much better, whereas in women, things tend to bleed together. And once again, being more casual with this video, let's look at an example that most of us can probably relate to, especially if you're married. Guys, have you ever come home from work after having a really bad day and you're in a bad mood and your wife says, "What's wrong?" and you tell her you had a bad day, and then she says, "Well, why don't you talk about it?" And you look at her and say, "No, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it at all." And the women are thinking to themselves, "Oh, he's just putting up a brave front. Why has he been taught to ignore his feelings in this way?" Etc., etc. When that's not it at all. For a guy, we compartmentalize. That is to say, work is work and home is home. The two don't mix. I can turn off work and everything that happens at work within 5 minutes of being home, even if I had a bad day. Why? Because I can compartmentalize that. I had a bad day and I'm not going to think about it again until tomorrow morning when I have to show up at work. Home is home, and it's a completely different arena. I don't have to think those thoughts at all until I get back there. It's compartmentalization. Or let's flip the script, wherein your wife comes home and she's had a particularly bad day, and all she does is talk about her bad day for hours and hours. And as a guy, you're thinking to yourself, well, if you had that bad a day and you really don't want to go through that again, then why are you reliving it over and over again by talking about it for hours on end? And you say to your wife, "Why don't you just forget about that? You're home now, just forget about it." And she probably flips out at you because no, she can't just forget about it. Why? Because she can't compartmentalize like you. Not to say that one way is better than another, it's just to say that men and women are different, and we experience things differently, and we use different mechanisms by what we experience. Men like to compartmentalize things. Women want to be known. So, one of the key factors within understanding a traditional hero is understanding compartmentalization. It's a part of the masculine. Again, not to say that women can't engage in it in their own way, but it's something different, and it has to be treated as something different. But my point in discussing this with this video is the fact that quote-unquote progressivism seeks to destroy the difference between men and women, and they do so by painting women as the ideal and men as demonic. And no, that's not just me. You have these feminists who were active in the 1970s and 80s now just coming straight out and saying, yeah, we kind of made up all these statistics which we then fed to the justice system in order for the justice system to be bent quite specifically towards women, to see them as saints and men as demons. Yeah, we did that deliberately and it was all false. And they don't care anymore. Why? Because they think they won. But that's just an aside. The point being is that they're trying to break down men's spaces quite specifically. Why? Because men having their own space is compartmentalization, which is part of being a man, and you got to break that all down. And again, break it all down. Why? Well, politically, we want the men to be less masculine. Therefore, they don't become protectors anymore. They don't think in a heroic way anymore. Therefore, either society crumbles or it's easy to take over, one or the other. And here's where we get into why I think there's going to be a resurgence of the traditional idea of hero. Because I would say people in Gamergate and Comicsgate and the like, we saw this coming a long time ago. Why? Because they came and took over our spaces. They destroyed our ability to compartmentalize things. This is the way your quote-unquote progressive people work. They say, can we come into your space? And then when they get into the space and are invited in, then they take up more and more space, and then they try to get control. And once they get control, then they kick you out of the space and say, no, this is our space now. You're going to have to go away. And there's plenty of examples of this. One of the most notable for me would be the comic message boards. It used to be about guys talking about comics. This was back in the 90s, which I was part of message boards. But since then, they slowly took over, these quote-unquote progressive people slowly took over these message boards and became the moderators for these message boards, and then shut out anybody who was saying anything that didn't agree with their ideology. Really, seriously, right now, if you go onto a comic message board and try and talk, even in a positive way, like saying, this is a good comic from Comicsgate, you'll get kicked off. I just did a video about a Writers Guild of America Association meeting, a Zoom meeting, where it had producers of television and movies and writers for those and writers for comics and all of these kinds of things all mixed together. And they were talking about this exact thing, how it was a plan, how they introduced this over decades, how they now control these spaces and had to be political and subversive in order to take over these spaces. And now that these spaces are theirs, they must continue to control them, and not only control them, but expand them outwards until it encompasses everything. Even so much as saying we need to take these ideas and insert them into every kind of story imaginable. So historical stories. And that's why you see things like Cleopatra right now, because they were talking literally about inserting these alphabet people ideas into Westerns. All these kinds of things, which again, if you know comics, you know that this happened in the early 2000s. Another very brief example of this was something I just showed on my community section and on my Twitter over this last week. It's a real-world invitation to a Hellfire Club Gala Ball, which they've been pushing within the X-Men comics for the last couple of years. This Gala Ball. And everybody who is a traditional comic reader are looking at it going and commenting to me, remember when the X-Men used to be, heroes instead of gallivanting off to gala balls? Why? Because they used to be a masculine thing, and now they've been taken over by the feminine, and so it's all about having a party. Sorry, I shouldn't slight all women like that. It's progressive feminine is what it is, if there even is such a thing besides feminism. But again, here's my point. The thing is that within these spheres, within gaming, and especially I would say within comics, we're made up mostly of introverts, if you ask me. Gaming, not so much. It used to be that way, but it's slowly turning another way. But the point is that you have these traditional masculine spaces, and they were taken over by these intersectional feminists and these quote-unquote progressive people, and they've made them their own. And other guys within the normal sphere, I would say mostly extroverts, would look at that and say, and have said, look, stop complaining. You don't have your comic books or your video games anymore. Who really cares? But now they've crossed the line. And again, we can see this, as I talked about last week, with the boycotting of Bud Light. A lot of people are saying that this boycotting of Bud Light and now Target is a product of people saying, you can't push this on children. And I would say, no, that was an afterthought. Maybe the Target thing, but not the Bud Light thing. That was an afterthought. What it is, and what it was, is the fact that these people have come into the men's spaces of your normal extrovert man, where he would compartmentalize his own space, where he could be alone, or he could just not think about all the cares of the world. They've come into his space and say, yeah, this is our space now. And boy, oh boy, do you ever not want to do that to a guy. It reminds me of that video I did on Gene Yang. He's a writer for Marvel and DC, and he did a Twitter thread where he said, either you're a progressive or you're someone who believes in blood and soil. And what is blood and soil? Well, it's an old phrase used by 1930s militaristic Germans. So either you're a progressive or you're one of them. And what was this whole conversation designed around? Well, he was trying to change over, and he was doing it within some books, trying to change over the slogan for Superman from truth, justice, and the American way to truth, justice, and tolerance. Why? Because it was used once within a serial within the 1940s. But the thing was, he went to go on and define what tolerance is, and all he defined tolerance as is progressivism. He basically defined tolerance, as progressives do, saying it's acceptance of this thing. And I went, No, it's not. Especially not in the 1940s when you're talking about it being used with Superman. So I went back to my 1930s dictionaries because, yes, I collect dictionaries, and I looked it up. And what is the definition of tolerance? Well, before progressives got a hold of the term, it was acknowledging that something is wrong, but putting up with it anyways. So here's the thing. Guys are very good at doing that because they can compartmentalize. Guys, you ever have a job where you needed the money, you needed the job, but when you went there to work, everything stank? I mean, really, I worked in a piggery. Things just stunk to high heaven. But I was able to put up with this. Why? Because I could come home and that stink was no longer there. And so I could get through this. I could compartmentalize. Because here's the thing. Guys can tolerate, according to the traditional definition of tolerate. That is to say, I understand this is a disgusting thing, but I'm going to let it be because I can get out of this situation. I'm going to compartmentalize. Yes, sure, I have to let it be over there, but it's not going to follow me over here. And some people are trying to claim that, well, this boycott that's going on right now, they just tried to push people too far too fast. I would say no. No, your understanding is that people can be changed into whatever you try to make them into. I would say there's a fixed human nature, and there's a specific fixed human nature for a man and for a woman, and you try to take that human nature for a man, and you try to expand it beyond the boundaries which is allowable. So you have guys, they need their ability to compartmentalize, to have their own space, and you've just tried to pull it over that line, and it's now snapped back. Because this whole social movement, it's not been accepted by guys. They do these experiments every once in a while, and they take just random men and they show them pictures of same-sex attraction, displays of affection, let's just put it that way. Now, if it's for women, well, that's something completely different, but if it's for guys and you're showing it to a guy, what did they record their brain waves as doing at that point when they saw that picture? It was revulsion. It still is revulsion. It's akin to them seeing a picture of maggots. That's literally what they did in this study. So this whole social movement of the last 50, 60 years, it hasn't been guys accepting this, as Gene Yang would take tolerance and say it's accepting. No, they've compartmentalized it. They've accepted it insofar as they have tolerated it according to the old definition. They said, yeah, you keep that over there. Just over there where I can't see it, you do whatever you want over there. As long as you don't come into my space, my compartmentalized space over here, we're fine. You do whatever you want. You keep that stink over there, and I'm going to stay over here and be in my own space. But no, for these quote-unquote progressive people, they need to take over every space. And so they came to these men and said, yeah, your space is now mine. You're going to have to deal with this stink. You're going to have to tolerate it everywhere, every time, with everything. There is no space that is yours anymore. And again, that's stepping over the line. Because if there's one thing that a regular guy can do to have his own time and space, is just to grab a beer, usually a cheap beer, and just have some time to himself. Doing whatever, doesn't matter. Just grab a beer, have some time to myself. But no, they moved into that space and said, yeah, this cheap beer is now ours. We're going to invade this space and you're going to have to put up with all of those outside things intruding into your space. You have no space anymore. It belongs, all of it belongs to us. And this is the end point of progressivism. This is the runaway train. It will always go to this point where they have to control everything, where they have to invade every space. Tolerance, in the old way of thinking about it, where you let it exist over there, you realize it's wrong, but it's not part of what you have to deal with, so you're just going to let it be. Tolerance, in that sense, is no longer acceptable. Tolerance needs to be expanded to the boundaries of you have to accept this in every way, in every form, in every place, in every shape. Quite honestly, I would take this to be a byproduct of the fact that, yes, within these socialist and communist propaganda and literature that you read over the last 100 years, they say to take people with mental problems and use them in order to get this to occur. But the problem is that they have now taken people with mental problems so far that you can no longer claim that they have mental problems. Therefore, these people have no access to any medical help to actually try to heal them in any way, and on top of that, they're starting to criminalize any societal or religious attempts to help these people as well. And so what do these people do? Well, they self-medicate. How do they self-medicate? Well, they self-medicate with a two-step narcotic. That two-step narcotic is one, acceptance, which then gives them a shot of dopamine, which is basically a narcotic, which means that the next time you actually need that hit, it needs to be more, and then more, and then more, and then more. Just like any drug. And so that's what these people are doing. These people have no access to any kind of mental help whatsoever. They're hurting, therefore they're self-medicating with approval, but this approval needs to be more and more and more all the time. Because that's the way narcotics work. That's the way dopamine works within the body. And so there is no enough acceptance for these people. There never will be. Therefore they have to have everything. They have to take over everything. And again, my point for this entire thing is, fortunately, that when people act this way, they're basically infantilized. They're basically acting like 2-year-olds. And what do you do with a 2-year-old? Well, you let him be, especially if you're a guy, you let him be. You'll let him run free, run loose for a little while, until he starts to cross the line. And when he starts to cross the line, then you lay down the law. As a guy, you say, okay, I was allowing you to do this and this and this, and I was ignoring it, but no, not anymore. Now you're going to follow my rules. They're going to be the way that they're supposed to be, and you're going to do what you're told to do. Which is, again, a way of saying that men like to compartmentalize. That's how they keep order. And this compartmentalization has been broken down so much by this movement, this pulling of the elastic in one direction for so long that it's tried to go too far. It's now snapped back, and people are saying, no, we're done. We're going to assert our spaces and the rules within them once more. You've pushed too far. Go back to where you're supposed to be. And if you won't, and they won't, then we're going to institute even earlier rules than that, where we say, okay, we're no longer going to tolerate this. We want clear and defined areas. We want clear and defined rules. We want clear and defined laws. We want clear and defined ways that people interact with each other, and the ways that men are men and women are women. And where is the bastion of all of that for a man? Well, the bastion of all of that for a man is the heroic ideal. And all of that starts with what we see around us right now, with guys finally acknowledging what is going on and then drawing a line in the sand and saying, you go this far, no further. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, the link is in the description and in the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels. I'm going to start showing more and more of the CROM the Destroyer art within the community section of my YouTube channel in order to hype up for the 4th of July when we open up the campaign for that book. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.